Welcome to the Sleep Factory, a quiet place where stories unfold slowly and sleep comes gently. Tonight, we have a calm and reflective tale to ease you into rest. So close your eyes, settle in, and let the story carry you. My name is David, and it's been exactly 1 year since the world changed forever. 365 days since the broadcast stopped, since the cities went quiet, since everything we once knew simply ended. I'm sitting here now by my small campfire, the flames dancing quietly against the darkness, and I find myself wanting to tell this story. Not because anyone might hear it, but because something about speaking these words into the night air makes it all feel real, makes it feel like I've actually survived. The first day feels like a lifetime ago now. I remember waking up in my apartment on Maple Street to the sound of sirens. Not unusual for the city, really. I made coffee, just like I had every morning for the past 8 years. Toast with honey. I checked my phone for messages, scrolled through the news. There were reports of some kind of illness spreading, something about unusual symptoms, but honestly, I barely paid attention. We'd had scares before, bird flu, other things that came and went. But by noon that day, the sirens had multiplied. By evening, they'd stopped altogether. And by midnight, I was sitting in my dark apartment, listening to a silence I'd never heard before in the city. No traffic, no distant conversations, no hum of air conditioners or televisions bleeding through thin walls. Just quiet. I stayed in that apartment for 3 weeks. I had enough canned food and bottled water to last me that long, and some part of me kept believing that everything would return to normal, that the power would come back on, that the phones would work again, that I'd hear familiar voices calling from the hallway. But each day, the silence grew deeper, and each night, I'd see fewer and fewer lights flickering in the windows across the street. The morning I finally decided to leave, I packed everything I could carry in my old hiking backpack. Some clothes, all the food I had left, a water filter I'd bought years ago for camping trips I never took, matches, a small first aid kit, and, almost as an afterthought, my grandfather's journal. He'd been a quiet man, my grandfather, someone who found peace in solitude. I figured if anyone's thoughts might guide me through this new world, it would be his. Those first few weeks outside were the hardest. Not because of what you might expect, not because of danger or fear, but because of the overwhelming silence. I'd walk for hours through empty neighborhoods, my footsteps echoing off abandoned houses, and the only sounds would be the wind and the distant call of birds who seemed to be reclaiming the world already. I learned quickly that the key to surviving wasn't about fighting or hiding or being afraid. It was about being quiet, about moving slowly and deliberately, about listening, really listening, to the world around me. The ones who had changed, they responded to sound, to sudden movements, to panic. But if you moved like you belonged there, if you kept your breathing steady and your steps soft, you could pass right by them. I developed rules for myself. Simple ones that became as natural as breathing. Never travel during the day unless absolutely necessary. Always have 2 exit routes planned. Keep your footsteps light. Carry only what you need. And most importantly, never, ever let yourself feel completely alone. That last rule was the hardest to follow until I met Rusty. It was about 3 months after I'd left the city. I'd found a small cabin by a lake, tucked away in the woods about 40 miles north. The cabin was perfect, isolated enough to be safe, close enough to water, with a small garden out back that someone had abandoned, but that still had vegetables growing wild. I'd been there for 2 weeks when I heard the whimpering. I found him hiding under the cabin's front porch, a golden retriever mix, probably about 2 years old, thin and scared, but not hurt. His collar said Rusty, and he had the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen. He was hungry, obviously lost, and when I offered him some of the canned chicken I'd been saving for myself, he ate it gently from my hand, like he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too quickly. Rusty changed everything for me. Suddenly, I had a reason to keep routines, to make sure I found enough food for both of us, to scout safe places to sleep each night. He was an excellent traveling companion, quiet when he needed to be, alert to sounds I might miss, and somehow always able to sense the best path to take through unfamiliar territory. We spent that first winter in the cabin by the lake. I'd managed to gather enough supplies during the autumn months, canned goods from abandoned stores, warm blankets, enough firewood to last until spring. Rusty and I developed a rhythm. We'd wake up early, when the world was still gray and quiet. I'd make a small fire and heat up whatever we'd eat that day. Rusty would patrol the perimeter of our little property, checking for anything unusual, though he rarely found anything concerning. The afternoons were for maintenance, checking our water supply, organizing our food, making sure our escape routes were still clear. I taught myself to fish in the lake, and Rusty learned to sit perfectly still beside me, watching the water with the same patient attention I did. Some days we'd catch enough for dinner. Other days we'd just sit together, enjoying the peace of the water and the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. Evenings were my favorite time. After dinner, when the sun was setting and the world was transitioning into night, Rusty and I would sit outside the cabin and just listen. To the wind in the trees, to the distant calls of birds settling in for the night, to the small sounds of the forest coming alive in the darkness. Sometimes I'd read aloud from my grandfather's journal, sharing his thoughts about finding contentment in simple moments. Rusty would rest his head on my leg and sigh deeply, and I'd realize that this quiet companionship, was something I'd never really experienced in all my years of city life. My grandfather had written about similar moments, times when he'd felt most at peace. "The world is always changing," one entry said. "But the important things, kindness, patience, the simple pleasure of watching a sunset, these things remain constant. They're what we carry with us, no matter what else falls away." Spring brought new challenges and new discoveries. Rusty and I began traveling again, looking for a more permanent place to settle. We'd heard rumors, passed along by other survivors we'd occasionally encounter, of small communities forming in certain areas. People working together, sharing resources, creating something new from what remained. We walked for weeks, following quiet roads that wound through forests and past abandoned farms. Rusty seemed to enjoy the journey as much as I did. He'd trot ahead of me, his tail wagging gently, stopping to investigate interesting scents, or to wait patiently while I consulted the maps I'd collected from gas stations and visitor centers. During those weeks of traveling, I learned something important about this new world. It wasn't just about survival. It was about rediscovering what actually mattered. Without the constant noise of modern life, without the rush and pressure and endless distractions, I found myself noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way morning mist rises from a river, the particular sound rain makes when it hits different types of leaves, the way Rusty's ears perk up when he hears something interesting, and how his tail moves in different patterns depending on his mood. We found our new home in late spring, in a small valley surrounded by gentle hills. There was an old farmhouse there, sturdy and well-built, with a barn that was perfect for storing supplies and a well that still produced clean, cold water. The previous owners had left behind a vegetable garden that had gone wild but was still producing food. Tomatoes and beans and herbs that filled the air with familiar, comforting scents. Rusty and I spent the summer making that place our own. I repaired what needed fixing, cleared the overgrown paths, and expanded the garden. Rusty appointed himself the official guardian of our chickens. Yes, we found chickens, a small flock that had somehow survived on their own and seemed grateful for the protection and regular feeding we provided. The work was satisfying in a way I'd never experienced before. Each day had a clear purpose, a tangible result. When I fixed a fence, it stayed fixed. When I planted seeds, they grew into food we could eat. When I gathered firewood, it kept us warm through the night. There was something deeply calming about this direct relationship between effort and result, something that had been missing from my old life in ways I was only now beginning to understand. By midsummer, we'd encountered a few other survivors who'd settled in the area. There was Mary, a former librarian who'd found refuge in an old bookstore about 5 miles south. She'd managed to keep a small solar panel working and had set up a kind of informal lending library, trading books and information with anyone who passed through. There was Jim and Sarah, a couple who'd turned an abandoned farm into a surprisingly productive operation, growing enough food to share with others. We developed a loose network, checking on each other regularly, sharing resources when someone was running low on something essential. It wasn't formal or organized, more like an understanding between neighbors. We'd meet once a week at the old community center, sharing news, trading supplies, sometimes just sitting together and enjoying the rare pleasure of human conversation. These gatherings became something I looked forward to more than I expected. Not because I was lonely. Rusty was excellent company, and I'd grown comfortable with solitude. But because there was something hopeful about seeing other people adapting, finding their own ways to build meaningful lives in this changed world. Mary would always bring books she thought we might enjoy. Jim and Sarah shared vegetables from their garden and taught us techniques for preserving food through the winter. And sometimes we'd just sit together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset and listening to the evening sounds of the world settling into night. As autumn arrived, I began preparing for our second winter. This time, I knew what to expect. I knew how much firewood we'd need, how much food to store, which parts of the house needed extra insulation. Rusty and I worked together with the efficiency of a team that had learned to communicate without words. He'd follow me into the woods when I gathered firewood, helping me identify the driest pieces. He'd sit patiently while I repaired the roof, alerting me to any sounds that seemed out of place. One evening in late October, as we sat by our fire after a day of preparation, I realized something remarkable. I was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever been before. Not the momentary happiness of achieving a goal or buying something I wanted, but a steady, underlying contentment that had grown slowly over these months of simple living. I thought about my old life often during those quiet autumn evenings. My job at the accounting firm, my small apartment with its view of other apartments, the endless cycle of work and sleep and weekend errands. It had felt normal then, even fulfilling at times, but now it seemed like I'd been living someone else's life. Like I'd been following a script written by people who'd never asked what actually made me feel alive. Here, with Rusty sleeping peacefully beside me, and the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, I felt more like myself than I ever had before. I was still the same person, but somehow simplified, reduced to the essential elements that actually mattered. Winter passed quietly and comfortably. Rusty and I developed indoor routines to complement our outdoor work. I taught myself to whittle, creating small wooden figures that served no practical purpose, but brought me satisfaction to make. Rusty learned to play a gentle tug-of-war game with an old rope, always careful not to pull too hard or get too excited. We read books by lamplight. Well, I read while Rusty listened, his head resting on my feet, occasionally lifting his ears when I changed my tone for different characters. My grandfather's journal became even more meaningful during those long winter evenings. His entries about finding peace in solitude, about the satisfaction of simple work, about the way animals could teach us patience. All of it resonated with my own experiences in ways I'd never expected. The measure of a good life, he'd written, isn't how much you accumulate or achieve, but how often you feel grateful for what you already have. The moments when you look around and think, yes, this is exactly where I want to be. I found myself having those moments regularly now. When I woke up to find Rusty stretched out beside me, his fur warm against my leg. When I stepped outside in the morning and saw frost sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. When I tasted vegetables from our garden and remembered planting the seeds months earlier. These small moments of recognition, of presence, had become the foundation of my days. Spring returned with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt since childhood. Rusty and I began expanding our garden, adding new vegetables, and even attempting a small orchard. We built better shelters for our chickens and constructed a rainwater collection system that would help us through any future dry spells. But more than the practical improvements, spring brought a deepening sense of belonging. This place felt like home in a way nowhere ever had before. Every corner of our property held memories now. The spot where Rusty and I had sat during our first snowstorm. The tree where I'd hung a bird feeder and learned to identify different species by their calls. The patch of ground where our first tomatoes had grown. Our network of neighbors had grown over the winter too. A few more survivors had found their way to our valley, each bringing their own skills and stories. There was David, a former chef who'd set up a small restaurant in an abandoned diner, serving simple meals in exchange for help with various projects. There was Elena, an artist who'd begun painting murals on the sides of buildings, bringing color and beauty back into spaces that had been gray and abandoned. The weekly gatherings at the community center had evolved into something more organized, but still wonderfully informal. We'd share meals, discuss practical matters like crop rotation and weather predictions, and sometimes just enjoy each other's company. Children had begun to appear too, either survivors who'd been traveling with families, or babies born to couples who'd found each other in this new world. Watching those children play reminded me of something important. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building something new. Something that incorporated the lessons we'd learned from the old world's ending, but that focused on the things that had always mattered most. Community, kindness, the simple pleasure of useful work and peaceful rest. As summer approached again, marking nearly a full year since I'd found this place, I realized that my fears about the future had quietly transformed into hopes. Not grand ambitions or elaborate plans, but gentle hopes for continued health, for good harvests, for the safety and happiness of the people I'd come to care about. Tonight, sitting here by my fire with Rusty sleeping peacefully beside me, I feel something I never expected to feel again after that first terrible day when everything changed. I feel optimistic, not because I believe the old world will return. I don't think it will, and I'm no longer sure I'd want it to. But because I've learned that humans are remarkably adaptable. We can find meaning and joy and connection even in the most unexpected circumstances. The fire is burning low now, and Rusty is making the soft sighing sounds that mean he's dreaming peacefully. In a few minutes, I'll bank the coals and we'll head inside for the night. Tomorrow will bring its own small tasks and quiet pleasures. There will be work to do in the garden, maybe a visit from one of our neighbors, certainly the simple satisfaction of another day, lived fully and well. I've learned that the end of one world doesn't have to mean the end of hope. Sometimes it just means the beginning of a different kind of life, one that's slower, quieter, more deliberate. One where you notice the small miracles that were always there, hidden underneath the noise and rush of everything else. One where you learn that the most important things, love, friendship, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the peace that comes from living in harmony with the natural world, these things don't disappear just because everything else changes. They're still there, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone willing to slow down long enough to notice them. And so here I am, 1 year later, with my dog and my garden and my books and my neighbors and my quiet, grateful heart. The world ended, and somehow life began. Rusty stretches and opens one sleepy eye, checking to make sure I'm still here beside him. I reach down and scratch behind his ears, and he settles back into sleep with a contented sigh. The stars are bright tonight, clearer than they ever were in the city, and the air carries the scent of growing things. Tomorrow the sun will rise on another day in this gentle world we've built from the ashes of the old one. Another day of simple work and quiet joy, of friendship and hope, and the deep satisfaction that comes from choosing to see beauty even in the midst of great change. And that, I think, is more than enough. It's everything, really. Everything that matters. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story brought you comfort or helped you drift off, we'd love for you to like and subscribe to The Sleep Factory. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you again soon.